So thank you guys again. This presentation to me is something that is obviously the roots of what we do. It's really the foundation of what we teach. How we teach it and how we create connections are all of key importance tied to that. That's really the foundation of that learning connection model. Looking at the learning connection model, we obviously have our three skills. The three skills: teaching skills, people skills, technical skills. Within our technical skills area, we have 8 fundamentals. Today, we're going to be focusing on 6 of those fundamentals, which we call our snowboard fundamentals. Those ones are specific to our discipline. So in the world of PSIA AASI, the different disciplines will change their fundamentals, but we'll have essentially a shared 2 fundamentals, which are knowledge and comprehension, and which also are movement analysis. So it's very cool to see that technical skills area have all 8 of those. The 6 snowboard fundamentals are what we're going to focus on today. So the first thing I wanted to bring up is not just the 6 snowboard fundamentals, but also where have we been, right? Sometimes it's important to know where we've been to figure out where we're going. And I think this is going to help us kind of connect to those things. So jumping back to where we've been. So as we look to where we've been, this was really some of the most important content that we brought to our membership, really, movement and performance concepts, being able to ground people through the basic athletic stance, using the connection between how the body moves and the ability to relate that to our ranges of motion. Movement concepts. The body can do 3 things. It can flex, extend, and rotate. And that's where we lived for a long time. I think that when we really started being able to better break down ranges of motion, we started to not only do what we had done before, which is, hey, I'm going to talk to the ankle, talk to the knee, talk to the hip, but we're able to better isolate and break down how these movements create what we used as our performance concepts. And these performance concepts are still present. So important thing to remember, all of your knowledge, all of the ability for you to be able to say, I've been doing this for 20 years. Don't tell me now that I have to relearn everything. Or don't tell me now that everything I've done in the past was incorrect. Well, it might have been, but that's up for you to really for you to decide. When we look back at, for me, for example, I look back and I'm like, man, I can't believe that that's what I thought at the time was the most important thing. And we're going to teach every student how to really overplant or flex their ankles to make the board twist. And this is going to be revolutionary. My mind has, developed and grown since that time. But looking specifically into our performance concepts: edge angle, tilt, torsional, flex, twist, rotation, snowboard pivot, and pressure distribution. So when we look at those things, we say, cool, that was really a great foundation for us to grow and STEM to the next level.
Yeah, I like what you said, Doug. It's evolved. I mean, I am dating myself a little bit, but I remember when the first National Snowboard Manual came out and these performance concepts were introduced. It was like, oh my gosh, this is awesome, because these coming from all of the certification, all of our education was we were teaching snowboarding like we were on skis, which wasn't the case. So it was really cool about this stuff being introduced is once and for all, we had an identification of the movements that we were making as snowboarding, how to apply that into lessons and the teaching and stuff like that. So it's really cool to see, have been there at the beginning, have been super stoked on it, but also watching how it's evolved into what we're using today, or we're going to talk about here in a little bit. So just wanted to throw that in there.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. Part of us in the world of snowboarding, we have our jargon. We have some of the stuff which is, it may be new, but our goal is to really keep it based around the real, right? So how do maybe some of the things that we used in the past maybe were jargon that was overused or maybe a little confusing. So let's jump into taking a look at the snowboard fundamentals. And then what I'd like to do is take some time to be able to break down some of what to expect in regards to that relationship, body movement to that specific fundamental in relationship to what happens with the board. Cool? So here are the fundamentals. They may, depending on what device you're on, they may be kind of small on your screen. I also have them broken down into 2 pages here. So we'll just jump into that first one. This one, controlling the relationship of the center of mass to the base of support to direct pressure along the length of the board. So while we think about the relationship center of mass, and so if I'm standing here and I'm able to give you a little bit of, get out here a little bit, the center of mass, okay, can we visualize the center of mass, right? Because the center of mass isn't an anatomical part of the body. It's something that if we take the entire mass of the body from all my fingers, all my toes, my legs, where is that center of mass, right? Generally, it sits just above the hips. Based on different body shapes, sizes, structures, that center of mass is going to generally shift higher or lower depending on the person. Obviously, little kids, they have the bigger head, the center of mass goes up, right? If we have a little bit wider, bigger hips, we may see the center of mass drop down. So visualizing that center of mass will help us throughout a lot of these fundamentals. Looking at that first one, the first one being this key to understanding how am I moving on the board. I'm going to grab a board right here, a little mini board. This is my home weapon. So you have to give a shout out to Nev and the Snowboard Addiction crew for this. But if we think about that center of mass shifting along the length, we're thinking about that board moving like this underneath the center of mass, right? And for us, it's really key to think about, hey, let's get the board, we're on a slippery surface, let's get the board sliding underneath the center of mass rather than us trying to get this move going on, right? We can go back to one of those great examples of our parallel relationships, shoulders, hips, feet, and be able to connect to that ability of, am I able to stay parallel as that board shifts or as that relationship between the center of mass and the board shifts along the length. This fundamental is the energy. This fundamental is what allows us to be able to take the board and be able to bend the snowboard. My favorite analogy in regards to this, when I see people really putting a lot of effort into how they jump, right? I am going to jump on my snowboard and this is what I'm going to do. So what they do is they take this amazing compound bow and they're like, they get strapped into it and they got their bow and then, okay, I got this carbon fiber arrow. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the bow. And instead of using the bow, they take that sweet carbon fiber arrow and they throw it. And I'm like, whoa, you got to learn to use the bow. You must learn to use the power of being able to load energy in the board, being able to flex the board, and being able to generate and create rebound or pop. So when we talk about pop, pop is not something that just happens. It's something that is an outcome of moving, shifting the center of mass, flexing the equipment, and being able to get that board to release. So as we look towards that fundamental, I think of that one as being really a constant flow. right? Always moving forward and back, always moving forward and back. And it can be paused, maybe because I'm going back into a tail press, or I'm holding that tail press as I roll down the mountain. And that will help us transition into the next fundamental. So we will come back to these. All 6 fundamentals have ability to have huge discussions on their own. So please take notes. So once again, control the relationship of the center of mass to the base of support to direct pressure along the length of the board. The next one, we talk about controlling the relationship of the center of mass to the base of support to direct pressure along the width of the board. So not only is our center of mass shifting like this, but most of the time when we move, we're generally like, our center of mass is probably tracking a little bit like this. It's probably not perfectly centered all the time. You know, if I am maybe going to do a press and I'm buttering and I'm trying to hold my center of mass here, it probably shifts a little bit like that, right? That's that center of mass shifting. One thing when we talk about moving the center of mass along the width of the board is we're not talking yet about creating board tilt. We're not creating that edging yet. One way we can also explain it, when we're running straight down the mountain, flat base to the snow, right? Are you simply just centered, or are you making small adjustments based on that width, that adjustment? How are you positioning, right? When I look at how the body moves, when I'm adjusting based on the width of the board, this is when we start to look at, okay, how am I moving in this plane? Which much of the time we get into stance because we get this, okay, I'm getting lower, but am I counterweighting with my booty? Do I tend to be a little bit more over my heel side, over my toe side? And it allows us, by looking deeper into this fundamental, allows us to actually do a lot of correction toe to heel in regards to stance. It also allows us to bring a lot of that precision of managing pressure from edge to edge without having to just throw the board up using inclination, angulation. Cool. So I know this one will be a good one to come back to. And this is one that maybe when you look at some of the questions that I posed in the supporting article, this might have a couple key little things that trigger. The first 2 we've covered so far are in the world of pressure. This next one is also in that scope, in that world around pressure, right? So when we talk TTPP, we're talking just the pressure right now. So jumping into the third, controlling the magnitude of pressure created through the board/surface interaction. So this one is, many people have questions about this, right? They say, well, why is this one missing the movement, right? Why isn't it talking about my center of mass? Why isn't it talking about flexion extension? So the key here is realizing that this statement, controlling the magnitude of pressure created through the board/surface interaction, this really works if you test it in all the different environments that exist, right? Which, if I think about the board and the sliding surface, that surface may be snow. It may be powder, right? Snow might be up here. I might be floating in here. It might be a box. It might be the side of a building, it might be your living room floor, which is more likely to happen today or tomorrow. So if we look at this, again, I'll get in a little bit of demo mode. Thinking about that pressure. If I drop, I'm shifting down, my center of mass is moving down, right? If I do that rapidly, I can do it fast enough where my feet come off the ground. Not the best angle here. Let's see if we can get a little, right? If I drop fast enough, the feet come off, we create a down unweighting. If I do the opposite of that, I can extend, right? Again, extending, but if I extend rapidly enough, I can unweight. See, I jumped high enough, you got my feet in that action. We can also retract, right? Retraction I can do just standing still. It does take a lot of effort. I'm connecting with the abs, retracting the legs up. Most practical situations with retraction, I'm combining that with board flex and rebound, so the effort is much less. We also take into account, okay, I'm riding with some speed coming down here, and then I roll off this cat track, right? The body, the board, the surface, how are we essentially controlling how much pressure is there in relationship to terrain? And then again, that connection to the rebound when the board flexes, how am I managing that pressure, that board pushing back? So this one is kind of a catch-all. I did want to kind of cover those three elements tied to pressure first, because I would say that is the big work that these guys really jumped into and covered with the creation of the 6 snowboard fundamentals, was getting into that breakdown of pressure. So big props. I really love being able to use it and explain it in application. Okay, so once again, just to give a quick highlight of what's happening here. Board moving underneath us, sliding, right, relative to the center of mass. We're talking the center of mass moving along the width. And then we're talking about the ability to create and control the magnitude of pressure down on the board, release that pressure. So as we jump into these next topics, we have a few more, 3 more to cover. Part 2. So our 6 fundamentals, we just covered the 3 elements of pressure. The next here is controlling the board's pivot through flexion, extension, and rotation of the body. So one of the biggest things when we talk about pivot, now we really need to understand another variable. And the key variable kind of connected to this is, sure, when I'm standing still and I'm doing something static, it's very easy for me to be able to show just, basic rotational elements, right? I can jump and I can spin and I can show how, okay, my head is going to help coordinate. I can use my upper body to, okay, I can either generate or anticipate. It's not until I really get down to my hips that I'm being able to actually get the board to pivot, right? So I'm thinking about, okay, once the hips start to pivot, the board starts to pivot. If the hips spin a 360, the board spins a 360. We can then work down to the legs. And then with our legs, we're feeling that connection to that ability to scissor the legs. This is kind of what I call the finish move with rotation, because as we start our rotation, say I'm trying to do a 5, generally if I start a rotation with a leg scissoring move, you don't have the energy to be able to carry through to a 5. Generally, we're looking at using leg steering through the shaping phase of the turn, not at the initiation phase of the turn, which is probably one of the bane of our existence as snowboard educators, is we are doing a lot of time trying to get people to steer with their legs later in the turn. So as we look at that, it all works fine in a static environment. As we take it into sliding down the mountain, now we have to connect to our direction of travel. One of the key questions I like to ask, really in that level 1 range, is what do we need to do? What does the rider need to do in order to avoid the dreaded slam, the dreaded edge catch? How do we train them to not catch their edge? And the biggest thing when we think about snowboard pivot, oh my God, is snowboard pivot is great as long as we understand that relationship to the direction we're traveling, right? So we have to visualize what direction we're traveling or about to travel or what arc we're traveling on, so that when I'm about to change my edge, I make sure I don't transition to the new edge until that direction of travel lines up through the board. This is going to work in every situation. This is going to work in a half pipe. This is going to work for a beginner. This is going to be relevant for when I hit a huge booter and I'm spinning. What do I need to do so that I can ride away? Okay, I'm spinning one of the crazy new trick, triple cork. As long as you line up the board with the direction you're traveling, then we don't catch our edge, right? That's the premise behind looking at how we can engage pivot. Controlling the board's tilt through a combination of inclination and angulation. So once again, boom, here's our list. Controlling the board's tilt through the combination of inclination and angulation. One of the really important things to understand here is that when we look at talking about what the body does, let's first start talking about when we're traveling through an arc, right? When we're traveling through an arc, naturally, the body will tip into that turn, right? So in regards to how the shape, again, this isn't a side cut, but that board back there has some side cut. If you tip that board on an edge, you'll naturally tip in. If you go faster, you can tip in more. That is just our basic inclination as far as being able to tip into the turn. Once we have inclination and we want to talk about the body's range of movements and how we're using joint angles to allow ourselves to maybe tip and lay down to the snow more. Maybe we're talking about how can I get into that really rad carving stance with that kind of more tucked knee and ripping, right? We start talking about angulation in combination with inclination, right? So we're not really using the joint angulation in isolation. It's always combined with the inclination when we're talking tilt, right? Again, what we're doing is we are what does it take to tilt the board? One of the biggest things when we talk about creating board tilt through the use of our angles and the use of our body, we start really looking at the boot, right? So when I talk about pressuring to the toe edge and say my boot is like this, my leg's coming out of here, right? If I'm in this position, the only position I can go is flexing towards my toe edge. So my shin flexes towards my toes. And as I do that, my hips drive forward so that I can have an aligned stance where I'm flexing, driving the hips forward. You should tip over, as in you should be inclinating. And what I like to do is I like to make sure that the rider, and when I'm looking at a rider, I'm trying to connect what I call that power line, that ability from through the head, through the hips, down through the edge. Is the rider the most stacked they can be so they're not creating a counterweight over that edge? On the heel side, we are pulling up the toes and letting the shoulders naturally recline back. This, again, helps to create that power line where the head, the hips, down through the heel edge are all stacked. And again, in that line where we can generate power, we can flex and extend while still remaining in a balanced position. That key is being able to use those shin muscles to pull the toes up to close the boot. And all the while, we are making sure that we are not pushing this boot back further than it comes like this, right? So this is the default position of the boot. We close that and we go back to this position of the boot. We avoid pressing backwards, as in bending the boot like this, right? That's kind of a poor technique that we try to coach around or coach through so that people have a good replacement and understand that by using the ankle closed and then back to default position of the boot, we can actually create a better overall stance and alignment over that edge as we tip or tilt into the turn. Cool. And then snowboard fundamental number 6. Snowboard fundamental number 6 is our ability, once we're strapped into the board, is that ability to actually create and generate that twist in the board, right? Don't be afraid while you guys are watching to be able to stand up and play with this connection, right? When you are being able to ride and watch a rider using movement analysis, generally this is one of the easiest things to see, because watch, the moment I start to twist, right here, the moment I start to twist, my knees are out of alignment. Knees are out of alignment, which is okay if that's my intention, right? So as I'm doing that, I'm connecting to that ability to create that twist, right? When we look at a rider, we can start to really connect that ability. So what is torsional flex good for? This is the great question of our time. So torsional flex, it is obviously something that as a snowboard, we have the ability to manipulate and twist and torque, right? Generate torque between the feet. One cool factoid is generally female riders have more ability to generate torque because of the hip and the Q angle. They're actually able to generate more torque and maybe not as powerful being able to generate pressure to the outside of the foot. So being able to understand that and understand the importance of coaching to specific demographics, specific student, is understanding how are we using torque to benefit the student. Skidded turns, huge benefit to be able to engage torsional flex at the initiation of the turn so that we create differential friction, so that the nose of the board takes a narrower, or the tail of the board takes a wider track. So initiation, torsional flex, creates a skidded turn. One amazing thing, especially with the growth and the hype around carving techniques, is it's so cool to see all these new carving techniques and these variations coming out of carving, that if you can add torsional flex, not at the initiation, but say we're carving, we set our edge, right? We have that good track, tail following the exact track of the nose, then I can sequence to a torsional twisting maneuver where it's maybe just my ankles or maybe my hips or maybe tucking my knee, so that then I can actually engage torsional flex as a component of edging to further engage and lock in an edge. This is something we can use while we're carving around the mountain. This is something that is a really functional tool when you're talking high-end tricks, especially in the half pipe. So that's kind of the breakdown. One key thing that I want to get us to remember is when we watch a rider who, such as myself, spend a lot of time getting people to plant our flex more than necessary, right? I'm on my heel edge and I'm going to plant our flex into the toe turn. That can create an opening of the boot, and that can help to support what I used to have, which I still have a little bit, is a little bit of my booty turn because of over plantar flexing to initiate my turn as the primary function to create a skidded turn, primary function to create board twist. So it's important to remember that using the ankles is good, using the hips to create that ability to generate more torque, right? More power, and also can avoid us from over plantar flexing the ankle. As you get more and more comfortable using the fundamentals, allow yourself to be able to isolate the individual fundamentals for the purpose of being able to coach and train to specific movements and then build them back together. If you get lost and you feel like you're not able to see which one is which, then break it down to a specific element of the board. Is the board being pressured this way? Is it being pressured this way? Is it flexing? Is it weighted or unweighted? Right? Is it being retracted? And is it pivoting? Is it edging? And of course, is it being twisted? Cool. Well, thank you guys. I hope you like that breakdown of the snowboard fundamentals.
And I think something to remember with these fundamentals is while each sentence is in itself kind of a techie phrase, if you really break it down and simplify what the sentences are saying, it's literally how we explain snowboarding in real time anyway. So it's like, cool, center of mass along the base of support along the along the length of the snowboard. Literally translates to move my way from nose to tail. Right. And that's how we talk to each other. That's how we talk to students. That's how it's a little more realistic. So if we can kind of set the techie portion of it to the side and make it a little more real, I think it makes a little more sense.
The more people can get familiarized with the fundamentals, the more they can realize that it's not a crazy thing, right? It's cool. We take pressure, we break that down into a little bit more detail, being able to understand pressure along the length, pressure along the width, and then controlling the magnitude of pressure with the board and the surface interaction. Cool. And then we have, of course, pivot, tilt, and twist. So it's just expanding out the pressure. It's getting more clarity.
And just to throw this out to the whole group, I wrote it in chat, but if there's anything that Doug covered that you would want to revisit or want more clarity on, like now's the time, just send a message, use the Q&A function at the bottom, whatever, and we can provide a little more clarity.
What up? How you doing, Doug?
I'm doing great, man.
A really nice job covering the 6 fundamentals and how they relate back to the board performances. I thought that was a really good description. And the main thing I wanted to add in was what you just covered and what Tony mentioned in chat, that the framework that the 2012 to 2016 team built and that we've been working off of, the work has been done by the Snowboard Task Force, and we cannot like go into these without crediting that team for the amount of work that they did. And it's a lot of that unsung hero work behind the scenes, long hours, fall conference, hashing stuff out. The 6 fundamentals was a massive project that really the credit goes to that team, not to the snowboard team. It's been an amazing project to get to be a part of and see it work through. But man, thank you so much to people like yourself and Leah Logel and the crew from Western. I mean, all of the leaders from Western have been so engaged in that, and that's where that work got done. So that's been an awesome project, and it's been really rewarding seeing them presented this year and seeing how people adopt them. I think seeing how they make so much sense to new members and to level ones, it's a little bit more work for those of us that have been working with them for longer to kind of come around to this new kind of paradigm. But watching, like, especially for a new hire going through maybe level 1 on both alpine and snowboard, the benefit's been really cool to see. And great work presenting. Thank you, Doug.
Emily Jackson had a really great question. I don't know if you want to save it for later when we open up for Q&A, or if you want to address it now. It kind of takes us back to the 3rd fundamental of magnitude.
Sure.
What do you want me to read? So the question is, or you can read it.
Okay. The phrasing board surface interaction, changing the amount of the tilt would radically change pressure between them. So I think one of the biggest things, and that's a great question, I think when we look at how we're saying the board and how we're saying the surface, when we look at the fundamentals, they rarely work in isolation, as in rarely do you find one without seeing or connecting with another. So that's one of the key things when we look at how do we use these fundamentals. Rarely are you going to say this functions without that, right? Generally, you're going to say, cool, this is how I can explain the ability to manage the magnitude of pressure. Here's the way that I can explain if I want to talk, and we'll talk tilt in a second, but when I talk about putting the board up on an edge, I still, although my surface area has changed, I still have the ability to flex and extend, to remove, do it rapidly. I can unweight the board, right? So that fundamental still holds true whether I'm flat, right? That movement unweights the board. On an edge, that movement unweights the board. So that's why you'll see that cool. Yes, certain environments will change, certain realities in regards to what the board will do. And that's where it's really cool once we start putting them back together, right? When we break them down, we talk about them in isolation. Once we really talk about snowboarding, it's always blending them together. How do I break them down so I can develop a basic skill? And then how do we blend these elements together? How do I create complex body movements or complex, whether it's sequencing or blending movements to create high performance sport outcomes, right? That's our key. So great question. We'll jump back into that one. Chris, do you have something?
Yeah, in the question and answer thing that came through, Dana asked the question and she wanted to know, do you think that pop has changed with board technology, things like camber, reverse camber, and hybrid and that kind of stuff? Would you like to talk about that now, or maybe put that on the parking lot tip for a little bit later?
Ooh, I love that question, because has pop changed? The short answer is no. So the tool that we're using to create and generate pop comes in thousands of different varieties, right? If I ride the same board in a longer size and a shorter size, well, I automatically start changing some of the physics behind the pop, right? And when we talk about pop, we're talking about the board's ability to bend and flex, but we're also talking about where the binding is mounted, the lever arm to that point that is the last point in contact with the snow. So by just changing the size of the board, not even getting into, is it cambered, rocker, hybrid, flat, yada, yada, yada. It's getting into that and understanding that by looking at, okay, well, the lever arm has changed, or the flex pattern of that lever arm, thinking out in the world of science of saying, cool, if I change any of those variables, the outcome or the necessary work put in to the outcome as far as how much pop I receive in return will change. So good question. Again, a good solid nerding out question.
Hold on, I got another Q&A here real quick.
Yep.
Let's see. I got a question for you, Doug, and this is coming from Tony. He asked, can we dig in deeper on generating twist in relation with stance difference, like duck-footed versus forward, or more of a free ride stance or traditional stance? And how can we apply the steering movement during the carve?
Cool. So a couple of things there. So the first thing is the stance and how we relate that to twist. The other thing is when we talk about, I don't know if I'd call it a steering movement. I would probably call it more of the ability to generate like that edge lock. If you do it the opposite way, you can promote and bust into a skid. So the first thing would be thinking about our stances, right? So the most anatomically correct stance for most people, again, most people, is going to be that duck stance. That would be a stance that if you're not strapped into anything, you jump up and down, you do a squat, you're going to be somewhere from straight to 18 degrees on average, right? And that's just because how our body structure works once our feet are about shoulder width apart. So if I rotate, say, just my back foot forward like this, so we still have the ability to create and generate that same amount or similar torque, but we may lose some of that ability because of the alignment of the knee in relationship to the hip, right? So that's where that ability to create that rotation, ability to align the hips, you may lose some ability to create that torque, but for the most part, it's going to be similar. You're just going to find the pressuring points are going to be different on different parts of your foot. You're going to find that if I'm here, I'm going to feel very opposite but similar sensations in the cuff of the boot, where once you're strapped in, you may find that this foot versus this foot is going to have a little bit of that opposite. One of the things is try it, strap in, get a board of both and see, can you generate as much torque And that's what it's about. It's about this leg in opposition to this leg. Is there more or less here? Generally, there's going to be a little bit less, but you're going to have that more aggressive ability to really drive energy towards the nose and then sweep the board back to the tail and drive it back to the nose. So you'll see that most racers are in that type of stance, and they actually want less twist and more of that fore and aft pressuring move. So I hope that answers the questions. Any modifications specific to seniors? Yes. As someone gets older and as they start to see a loss in muscle mass, when muscle mass starts to go down, generally it's wise to start making some equipment changes. But that's where I also start to say, especially working with snowboarders that maybe have snowboarded a long time and they have that knee pain, generally it happens because the repetition of movements aren't balanced left to right side of the body. That connection is very important. Most injuries are caused due to imbalance, not due to weakness. So generally with snowboarders, the imbalance, it's, maybe I just went too slow or too fast. Sure, that's understandable. But having something that, my knee, something's not right, or something happened with my ankle, generally that's an imbalance left to right side of the body. So part of it is being able to train people and promote more balance, especially towards that senior audience. And then also looking at, maybe range of motion is starting to decrease. Maybe my intensity levels are going to come down, and therefore the outcomes that I'm going to ask for are going to be adopted. Right. But again, it's based on muscle mass, it's based on range of motion, and it's based on potential risk, right? Okay, that potential risk I'm going to also bring down. Such a positive, and being able to really embrace kind of the next phase of what we're doing, but also coming from a place of, hey, this is some really positive stuff to, in the end, simplify it and introduce it to a lot of people. This season, I was able to introduce the 6 fundamentals to quite a few people, and quite a few of those new instructors, those instructors that had just been, maybe it's their first or second season of getting into the world of snowboard teaching. And it really helped bring a lot of clarity to those new instructors. I know with the most experienced instructors, that's where we see these guys and gals have their methods, and sometimes changing those methods are difficult because we are habitual creatures. We tend to get very comfortable in what we do. But what makes us true masters, kind of going back to one of the webinars by Dustin Sem, was really challenging ourselves, right? Not allowing that complacency and continuing to say, hey, what did I do in the past that could be better, right? So I think this is really the delivery of that. So thank you much. Anybody else who would like to jump in to video, please just use the hand raise function or just chat and say, let me in.
Hey, Doug, we got another question from Lynn here.
Okay.
It's in the Q&A. It says, if men generally have a Q angle between 8 and 14 degrees, and women have a Q angle between 11 and 20 degrees, and women can typically create more torque with less ability to pressure outside of their feet, what about the men in the higher Q angle range? Since their pelvis is more upright, where do the snowboarders typically sit in terms of fore and aft pressure and twist? And is it disadvantageous for a man to have a higher Q angle with a typical skeletal structure, and how?
So one of the things that we can't change as individuals is our skeletal structure, right? So we can't change how my body is different from yours. All that we can do is say, okay, this is what I can relate to for me personally, and then better understand what the biomechanical structure of our students is. So if we're working as a group, we're going to say, okay, what we have is what we have. How do we adapt to those things? So when we're talking specifically about the Q angle, what's very, very important is that we all really take that connection to understanding pelvic tilt, because by flattening the pelvis, all of us are able to get the ball and socket joint, right? We're able to position our pelvis in a way that is going to increase that range of motion of the femur by flattening the pelvis. So that is going to be step one, right? Because by doing that, then we're increasing the range of motion of the femur. The femur going down into the knee is what's giving us that Q angle. So much of the limitation that we find with riders, whether it's being able to generate torque, whether it's being able to generate that pressure to the outside of the foot, right? We have our in version and our E version. So that E version, if I have a pelvis tipped forward, my knees are likely to diverge in, and that puts me on the inside of my foot automatically. So with a little bit wider hips, and again, it's not guys or girls, it's relative to you or relative to that specific rider. So wider hips relative to the length of the leg are what's going to allow you to generate more torque, right? Again, that's going to come from a flattened pelvis.
Yeah, and I can speak to that one pretty specifically. As a taller rider and built a little knobby knee, my knees tend to dive in a little bit, and just how I'm built with longer limbs. And so in the earlier days, early 2000s of riding, the habit for snowboarding was a little bit wider stances. And I thought to combat my longer legs and my giant feet, that a super duck stance was the answer. And all that led to was my knees caving in, and which is probably why I have knee trouble to this day. And so as the years went on and understanding that a little better, the stance adjustment and the angles of my feet were a big contributor to fixing that. And so going from, I used to ride like 21, negative 21. And so when I started to bring that more toward like 12s or 9s, that allowed my knees to track over my feet a little more correctly, but to a lot less knee pain. That Q angle that I have, which is a little steeper than most men, became a little bit less of a problem.
That's awesome. Well, thank you for sharing that, Asa, because I think that is like, learning from what works for other people is a big part of learning more about ourselves. And that's why as educators, we are, blessed with the ability to connect with so many, right? And that's why we like to say that, as a teacher, I can learn more than one of my students ever could, because I've got all these people that I can get information from. So being able to adapt that to yourself, I think, is very cool, and relating it to a different body structure, right? Because everybody is going to be a little different. So cool.
Yeah. Thanks, Doug. Again, awesome presentation. And I like the way you kept it real simple. Again, Chris just echoed my point there, but the other point I wanted to make is that as people look into this and they take on the new 6 fundamentals of snowboard, some people will look at it like, oh, this is a new way. It's not a new way. It's just a new way of delivering it or branding it. It's kind of like rebranding an old product, so to speak, where it's all the same stuff that we've been pushing, just getting more clarity on it. And it was interesting being in some of those conversations within that, and how we spent some time working through the whole 3 different ways to manage pressure on your snowboard, and then we're able to lay that out in these in 3 of the separate fundamentals. So I think that adds a lot more detail to people, for people, as they start to present it to their students. So love this, love where it's going, and I love how you presented it in a nice, simple, easy way to understand. Thanks for that.
The whole point of the fundamentals, like that common language to unify the fundamentals across our disciplines, that was the goal there. But none of us are expecting anyone to memorize those as like word for word what the fundamentals are. Like if you can remember about moving center of mass along the length of the snowboard across the width, that one of them is about managing tilt. Like it's not the word for word memorization that we're looking for. It's the concepts, like the way they're written is to tie in with the other fundamentals. The way we use them is much more vernacular.
A little bit about myself. I started teaching in 99. In 2001, I got my level 1. In that year, in 2000, is when I really started writing. I really started writing stuff tied to snowboard teaching. The first thing I wrote was terrain park and freestyle coaching safety, which we used for the freestyle coaching programs I launched at Whiteface Mountain in the 2000-2001 season. I then was able to connect with some continued growth with content as I moved out west in the fall of 2001 and moved to Sugar Bowl. I kind of came and got to get my level 2, get my level 3, and then realizing, hey, we can do more in the world of that freestyle coaching. You'll find this was a bit of a trend in my career, is that I continued to stay in professionally focused towards some freestyle stuff. I helped to write and then create the freestyle accreditation program, which is now the National Freestyle Specialist Program, collaborating with a whole crew of the attendees here. So at that time, it was 2004. I was writing content focused specifically towards the freestyle program. And in 2005, 2006 season, we launched that, which was my first year on the Western Ed staff. I then spent some time doing all sorts of different stuff, and eventually led me to writing or being the third contributing author to this little handbook, which is so cool because I still see people pop it out. Neil Boussiere was the first author with this. Ken Matson was the second, and myself as a third contributing author. The last edition of this came out in 2011. So we definitely continue to have more work to do. As I mentioned, the freestyle standards worked with that group. Before we had the national snowboard standards, I wrote the snowboard standards for the West. And fast forward to today is being able to share some content with you guys, which is, you'll see me looking up because I have two screens, sharing some content with you guys, which is super cool, which I am very excited about because, let's see here, I'm jumping screen to screen. This I'll share a link to, but the 6 Snowboard Fundamentals and some really cool, fresh content for us to not only better understand how those fundamentals relate to what we do, but also some key questions that we can share with people to help them better understand what's the right questions to ask. I find that when we are introducing snowboard technical stuff, it's not always the content that we're pushing, but it's the getting people to ask the correct questions. So I'll share the link with this so everybody's able to engage and be able to see that. Maybe it's go through with a fine-tooth comb, share your feedback, but definitely excited to offer some fresh content.